Hi, everybody. It's Mike Morse here on Open Mic. Our next guest is the executive director of the Innocence Project of Texas and has just had one of the most fascinating victories in the country, successfully freeing Lydell Grant, an innocent man who was locked up for almost 10 years for a murder he did not commit. A young Texas man by the name of Aaron Shearhorn was stabbed to death outside a Houston nightclub in 2010. 6 different people, 6 eyewitnesses identified him on the stand, swore under oath that it was him, Lydell Grant, as the murderer, and all 6 of them got it wrong. The truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. That's what you're going to hear on my podcast, Open Mic. I'm going to tell you things that most lawyers won't tell you. We expose the truth and bring you justice. I want you to go for the win in law and in life.
You want an honest man, but you don't understand. I want to be here when.
Joining us now is Mike Ware of the Innocence Project of Texas. Welcome to Open Mic.
Thank you, Mike. It's really great to be here. Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. So tell us how and why you got involved in the Lydell Grant murder case.
Well, I run the Innocence Project of Texas, which is a nonprofit that I co-founded back in 2006 here in Texas. And we get hundreds of letters a month, and from inmates or inmates' families requesting our help, and almost all of them, claim that they are innocent and have been wrongfully convicted of an offense that they had nothing to do with. And this letter from Lydell, Mr. Grant, came in much like the other hundreds of letters that we get. And it made it through our vetting system. And I ultimately assigned it to a student that I teach. I teach an actual innocence clinic at Texas A&M School of Law, in which the students take real cases and study them. And I assigned this case to a student, and he noticed, and we started looking at the case, that that the DNA in this case that was extracted from the victim's fingernails, and because of the nature of this crime and how the murder took place, any foreign DNA under the victim's fingernails would be highly relevant, highly probative. That they extracted DNA from the victim's fingernails that didn't belong to the victim, that almost certainly belonged to the murderer, and that Lydell Grant was obviously excluded as the donor of that foreign DNA. And yet, when we went back and looked at the trial testimony, the Houston Police Department forensic scientist, lab person, DNA person, testified that in fact the testing was inconclusive and that Lydell Grant could not be excluded as the contributor. So that was not helpful, along with the 6 eyewitnesses who testified.
Let me slow you down. Was that a flat out lie?
Effectively, yes. It since it's a mixture, and since it was in 2011 when they did the testing, 2012 when she testified, you could make a case based on what they knew then that it was inconclusive. But what you would have to say, giving them the benefit of every doubt, is that if Lydell Grant is in there, there is definitely a third party in there that is neither the victim or Lydell Grant. That much is very obvious, even back then.
At trial, did they identify that there was another person?
No, did not.
This is inconclusive. We don't know if it's Mr. Grant's or not.
They said it's inconclusive, and they just left it at that, which is that's a meaningless term. You hear it a lot particularly from law enforcement DNA people, it seems like inconclusive is really can mean anything and mean nothing.
Yeah.
And the prosecutor pushed the technician and said, well, if it's inconclusive, that means Mr. Grant cannot be excluded, correct? And the lab person went along with that. Yeah, well, I guess logically, if it's inconclusive, you and I can't be excluded.
Right.
And
Nobody, the judge can't be excluded.
Right. But they didn't make it clear that that's what they meant by that term.
But Mike, did the defense have the DNA looked at by their own expert?
No, not that I know of. If they did, the expert, and I'm almost certain they didn't. I did talk to the defense lawyer, and so no, and should have. But it's odd when I went to the DA's office with this information and talked to a lawyer who had been court appointed to do post-conviction DNA testing for Lydell, and showed it to them and just spelled it out for them, by the numbers. The lawyer who had been court appointed said, even my expert didn't pick up on that. And so I'm thinking, what's the deal? My student and I, and we're not far from being experts. Right. It's a very simple reading where you can see that this is not right,
So, wow. So we jumped, we went to the DNA before we went to the eyewitness stuff, because I find the eyewitness stuff that really fascinating, that Mr. Grant was identified at trial by 6 eyewitnesses.
Yes.
But the reason you were able to get him out of prison was because of the DNA.
Yes.
But the reason he was convicted was because of these 6 eyewitnesses.
Yes.
All right. So we're going to come back to the DNA because I think it's fascinating. And a teaser alert, they may or may not have found the actual killer, but we're going to talk about in a second. Does the way the murder happened, is it relevant to the story? Because you mentioned that you mentioned something that led me to ask that question. Should we hear a brief synopsis of how this happened?
I think so. I think so, because it was fairly unusual. I'm not saying it's unique, but it's fairly unusual. And this happened on a Friday night in the happening area of Houston, Montrose. And it was December the 10th, 11:45, close to midnight. And people were at this nightclub and milling around on the outside of the nightclub, et cetera. And all of a sudden, this unfortunate, poor victim comes running up the steps of the nightclub and says, "Please help me. He's trying to kill me." And I believe, as the record shows, the nightclub bouncers did not take it too seriously and said, "You guys just keep it outside." And I think the young man, Aaron Shearhorn, opened up his shirt and said, "Look, he's already stabbed me once." And anyway, at that point, the actual perpetrator came running up after him, and Aaron Shearhorn, being denied admission into the club, went running off. The perpetrator caught him. They wrestled, they tussled, they rolled around. Aaron was stabbed several times. He got up, got away, was tackled again. There was more struggling. And ultimately, the perpetrator walked off into the night, and the victim was pretty much dead at the scene. And no one knew either party. I mean, the perpetrator of the witnesses, the perpetrator and the victim, were unknown to anybody. There were more than 6 people that saw this. 6 people actually testified in court. And, the police, of course, make the scene, and the victim is identified. And there are people who at least know him. They were not witnesses to the event, and they have no idea who would have committed this murder. And they have no idea what events would have led up to this murder. Nobody knows what he was doing 4 or 5 hours before this happened. And so it's a mystery at that point.
But interestingly, so you did a really nice job telling that story. I'm putting myself at that scene, right? And I've been to Houston. I've been to, I get it's a busy scene, but somebody coming up saying they were stabbed, and then another person coming up and tackling them and grabbing them, and there's a crowd of people watching, right? Lots of people saw the perpetrator.
Yes.
And I assume there was some kind of composite done, some kind of.
There was never a composite done that I know of. And those composites always cause more mischief than they do good. But in my opinion, but what they did do is they interviewed at least I believe 7 witnesses. They interviewed them on videotape, over the next 12 hours or so, and got their description of the events and their description of the perpetrator. And the descriptions, there was a broad range. I mean, some said he was 6 foot, some said 6'6", some said 200 pounds, some said 260 pounds. There were certain consistent things. They all put his age. They all said a black male. They all put his age at late 20s, early 30s. If they described how he was dressed, they all said he was wearing an orange shirt. Apparently he was dressed pretty well, like he was, out for the evening, which was, seemed odd as well. So that's what they had to go on at that point.
How'd they find your client? How'd they find Mr. Grant?
Well, 24 hours later, Saturday night, Mr. Grant was parking his car in that very parking lot where this had taken place. And one of the bouncers or one of the employees of the nightclub saw him and thought, well, that looks similar to the guy who, committed this murder last night. I mean, he's a black male. He's between 6 feet and 6'6". He's between 200 and 260 pounds. He's not wearing an orange shirt, but, he's late 20s, early 30s. And so he calls it in to Crime Stoppers, I guess, hoping to collect, and I think did collect a reward, and says this is the car he's driving. Somehow this, witness got the VIN number for Mr. Grant's car. It wasn't the license plate number, but he got the VIN number and called it in. And of course, that information eventually made its way to the detective who put the car together with Mr. Grant and then the detective working the case, put a photo spread together with 6 photos, Mr. Grant's photo being one of them, and proceeded, I guess, all day long Sunday, which would have been the 12th, I suppose, December the 12th, Sunday, I believe, going to the various witnesses and getting them to pick Mr. Grant's picture out of the photo spread.
And none of, I read a lot of articles about this case and this whole ID. So all 6 people picked Mr. Grant, even though it wasn't him.
Eventually, to some degree or another. I mean, they were sort of ran the spectrum to that's absolutely him to, now this part was not videotaped.
Right. That's what I was going to point out.
Yeah.
It's fascinating that wasn't videotaped, wasn't recorded. Was there suggestive tones and finger pointing, and was it this guy right here? And we don't know because it was done either at their homes or in an office. It wasn't, you didn't have people literally standing in a lineup. Not that those are that much better anyway.
Right.
But there's a photo lineup, and the cops obviously concluded eventually that Lydell Grant was their person. And they
right. And understand this was conducted, and this is kind of an important point, in a non-double blind manner. And that means that the investigating detective who's presenting the photo spread to the witnesses knows exactly which one of those photographs is the suspect. Now, in the spring of 2011, less than a year later, we at the Innocence Project of Texas were able to go to the legislature and get them by law to change the way police conduct these photo spread identification procedures, such that the individual administering the photo spread does not know which one of the 6 is the suspect. And the reason the law changed is because it was well known that if you don't do it that way, the detective who does know who the suspect is will tell the witness who to pick. That's why we had to change the law. That's why the legislature agreed to change the law, because that's such a well-known fact. And I'm sure that's what happened in this case.
Well, good for you for getting that law passed. That's amazing. Just a little too late for Mr. Grant, unfortunately. So how did his trial go? I mean, did he have decent counsel with him? I'm sure it was court appointed, from what I remember. How did the trial go?
Well, he by all accounts, the lawyer that represented him at trial is a good lawyer. He was court appointed. He certainly in hindsight, he should have had his own DNA expert that hopefully would have caught this. But take that out. I mean, there were 6 eyewitnesses, and by the time they testified in front of the jury, the prosecutor has them so conditioned to make eye contact with the jury and to be completely sure that's the person, and has coached them how to be convincing to the jury. And of course, jurors tend to believe eyewitnesses anyway, even though it's probably one of the most unreliable forms of evidence.
It is. Yep.
And so Mr. Grant had an alibi. He'd been with someone else almost the entire night, certainly during the stretch of time that this murder took place. And, they called his alibi witness, who was a credible witness, who said, I was with him all night, and no, he didn't murder anybody. This is what we did. This is where we went. But, what I have, discovered through this work is jurors never, ever believe alibi witnesses. They never believe alibi witnesses. In almost every exoneration case, or so many that I've, looked through the record on, there's been an alibi witness, because if you didn't do it, if you're actually innocent, what other defense have you got? I wasn't there. I don't know what happened. Here's where I was, and jurors never, ever believe it.
It's a really interesting point. We've had lots of wrongfully convicted people on open mic here, and I can remember a couple of clear-cut alibi cases where the jury did not believe it, and nobody surmised what you just did. That they just don't believe them. But that's really interesting to me, that you find that across the board, and I think you're right. So he was convicted. He was sentenced to how many years? Was it
life? And
Mr. Grant submitted a letter. Your team, who gets hundreds of these requests a month, has obviously a very good vetting process, because whoever you have vetting it, the students at Texas A&M and whoever else, were impressed with this enough to take a deeper dive, look through the transcripts, look through the evidence. And what's astonishing, and you already said this, is that a law student, found the DNA anomalies. And you already said that, but it's, I'm looking at my notes here. It's fascinating.
Yeah.
I mean, when I was in law school, I don't even know if there was DNA. I think the OJ trial hadn't even happened yet, but it's impressive. I mean, this law student, saved this guy's life.
Yes, he certainly was a very important part of that. Yes.
And so you were saying earlier that when this person did this student bring it to your attention and say, look what I found here?
Well, the way we run our clinic, we have maybe 10 students in the class. They all have their own case. And once a week, we meet for 2 hours and discuss the cases. And so when it was his turn to discuss his case, that's how it came to our attention.
And so you see this information. He's already been in prison for almost 10 years. Do you have an expert you work with? I assume you have an expert you work with who you took it to?
Yes. I mean, yeah. And in a sort of like, are we crazy, or do you see what we see? That kind of thing. And yeah, Angie Ambers who is, with a forensic school in Connecticut now. But for a long time, she was in Fort Worth. And so we got Angie Ambers on board, who's an excellent DNA person, and she started helping us get this process, shepherded through, where we could take it to the next stage and then the next stage, and everything just started falling into place.
And how quickly? I mean, I have a name here, Gianmarco Carter. This is the individual, 42-year-old individual who actually killed. And what was the murder?
Yes.
How quickly between the time that your expert looked at it did you have this guy's name?
Well, actually pretty quickly. I mean, it's all relative, but what happened was that, we brought this to the attention of the Conviction Integrity Unit at the Harris County District Attorney's Office. And, once again, we kind of had to walk them through it. Said, see this loci here. None of the alleles in this loci are Lydell's, and 2 of the alleles are the victims, and 2 of the alleles are somebody we have no clue who they are. And that's same true at this loci, at this loci, at this loci. Ergo, Lydell is excluded, and somebody else, an unknown individual, is in there. And they were like, well, you want us to retest the DNA? And I said, that's fine. You can do that. But why do I want to retest the DNA? The original test excludes my client. Why create more things that can go wrong? Just give me the original data that generated this DNA report that excludes my client, and let me take it to Angie Ambers, our expert, and let her take it to the people she wants to take it to. And then if y'all want to go ahead on some parallel track and take it to the Texas Department of Public Safety and let them test as well, then that's fine. But that's up to you. In the meantime, I want the original data analyzed by people who have more sophisticated ways of analyzing mixtures than the way it was done back in 2011.
And they said,
well, we took it. Angie took it to Cybergenetics in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and they have a probabilistic genotyping software called TrueL, which has been vetted and validated, et cetera, et cetera. It's a highly accurate, sophisticated way of analyzing mixtures. And so they ran it through their TrueL software, and they said, well, we've extracted the profile of the unknown donor. We don't know who it is. We don't know you don't know what they look like. We don't know if they're dead or alive. We don't know if they're from, Europe or Russia or the United States. We don't know anything about them, but it's a male profile, and all these different numbers are associated with this male profile. And it is such a strong profile and so reliable that we can get this uploaded into the national database. And if this profile belongs to an offender who has already been entered into the national database, then we'll find out who it is. And so I've never, I said, yeah, sure, let's do that. And
sounds good to me.
What's that?
It sounds good to me. And I'm sure
it sounds good to me. I'm not, my experience has been private entities cannot get that done. You have to go through a law enforcement agency, and law enforcement agencies, it's very difficult to get it done through them because, they have all these rules and regulations they hide behind, which are basically designed to prevent you from exonerating people.
Not help you. Opinion. They're designed to not help.
Yeah.
Like you. And
so fortunately they could do it and did do it. And we didn't have to wait on law enforcement to do it. They got it entered through a sheriff's office in South Carolina that they had a relationship with. And it came back with a hit. And so we got notified. It was just a couple of weeks later. we got notified, and we were very anxious to see who it hit, because, you know, you want to corroborate, you know, trust but verify. I mean, was it, you know, some, you know, 5'5" lawyer from Oregon, or was it, you know, well,
whatever, right?
So we looked it up, and he was, you know, a 6'2", 220-pound black male from Houston. That was or at the time would have been the exact age that everybody described him as.
Wow.
And then, you know, on further investigation, we found out that he had been arrested, I think not 100 feet from that very spot where the murder took place, about 8 months before that, for some little crack deal, I think. Wow. But he was definitely out of jail when this murder took place. And when we tried to locate him, you know, in 2019, when all this information came up, we found that he had quickly left Houston after this murder took place and had relocated to the Atlanta, Georgia area.
And wasn't he arrested in Atlanta on different charges or something? Was he sitting in jail when you guys were going through this?
Well, when we first found this out, he was at large. Nobody knew where he was. He had an outstanding warrant for his arrest out of Georgia, and he had in fact stabbed somebody else in Georgia, according to a police report we found. But you know, we took all this information to the DA's office, and to some extent, they were like, well, okay, that's very interesting. I'm like, well, you know, go arrest this guy, you know, do something. They're like, well, how are we going to find him? You know, I'm like, well, you're the police, you know, you can find anybody. You always find my clients.
Did you, you must have, Mike, wanted to beat your head against the wall.
Yeah.
After talking to them. Like, I mean, like they, oh my God, this is crazy story.
So, anyway, that was in the summer of 2019. And, you know, they were somewhat skeptical of this whole process we'd been through. And so they fortunately hired somebody very competent to advise them on all this. A guy named Mike Coble, who's also from Fort Worth, with the University of North Texas Health Science Center. And he assured them that, number one, that TrueL Software and cybergenetics were the real deal. That's a highly reliable way of unraveling mixtures, and that what had gone into the CODIS database as an unknown had gone in. All of that had been done brilliantly and precisely and correctly, and that this was a legitimate CODIS hit. This Carter was a legitimate CODIS hit. And so they were like, okay, but they still want to investigate my client. They still want to subpoena his bank records. They still want to download his phone. They still want to, they're still trying to find some connection between him and the murder, or something they can argue is a connection.
2019?
Yeah.
He was already in prison.
Well, yeah, but you know, but we're filing legal actions to have him released.
So rather than going out and finding Carter, they want to keep investigating your guy who's sitting in a life in prison sentence.
Yeah.
Okay, that's very strange.
Yeah, and
rather than going to find Mr. Carter and investigating him.
Yeah, I know. It was frustrating, but to their credit, eventually, in late December of 2019. I got a call from the DA's office, and they said that Carter had been arrested in Atlanta, Georgia on other charges, and that the Houston Police Department cold case detectives had flown to Atlanta, Georgia, and had interviewed him. And in about 2 hours, he fully confessed to this murder, and they had it on videotape. And that at that point, they said they would agree to relief for Lydell Grant.
Isn't that nice of them?
Well, take what I can get.
Well, listen, you did a fabulous job. The story is frustrating. I'm frustrated all these years later. It's actually been only a couple of years. So I'm curious, you know, did Mr. Grant know what was going on during these months that went by once you guys knew that there was another name? You knew he didn't do it. You knew there was another suspect or more than a suspect. did you, or did you keep him kind of in the dark, not to get his hopes up? What did you do?
Well, as soon as, we found out that there was a CODIS hit, I went out to the prison and talked to him about it. And, I kind of wanted to know, did he know this guy? Had he ever seen this guy before? There's no reason why he would know him,
Right.
or would have seen him before, but still, but of course, I didn't want him talking about it. So, I didn't want to be there be any accusation of tainting anything. So I was somewhat limited in what I told him, but I did tell him that we had found the actual guy and that I was confident that things would start going better from that point forward. The DA's office at that point, without getting into the legal aspect of it, at that point, after the DNA came back, he was eligible for bail. And so we tried to get the DA's office to agree to bail, which they would not do. And so all the communication with Mr. Grant was traveling to the prison and talking to him. And we tried to keep him apprised. Now, in November of 2019, the DA's office finally agreed to bail. And we had a hearing set up twice. We had a hearing set up earlier to put our case on for why he should get bail. And because the DA's office wasn't agreeing. And then the DA's office asked for a continuance. So, we had a room full of Lydell supporters, but we had to send them all home and say the DA's delaying this process. And but then we came back the week before Thanksgiving in 2019, and we had another hearing set up. And this time before the hearing, the DA's office agreed to bail. And so we got him out on bail on the Wednesday before Thanksgiving of 2019. So from November of 2019 to December of 2019, he was out on bail, and he remained on bail, I guess, here until this last month, May of 2021, because the Court of Criminal Appeals sat on the case that long. And in May of 2021, the Court of Criminal Appeals found him actually innocent. And right after that, the Harris County District Attorney's Office dismissed all charges against him. And so at that point, he is no longer on bail, but he's only been off bail for about a month now.
Wow. What a story. Congratulations. I mean, he, had this, in 2011, they had the technology. These other companies have been around since 2011. Had the DNA been tested properly in 2011, they would have, well, if Mr. Carter was already in the system by then, they would have found him then.
The technologies have not been, they may have been around back then, but they were not generally accepted in the scientific community until later on. I would say beginning more like 2015, 2017, in that area. Now, I think possibly, another analysis could have been done that would have reasonably excluded Mr. Grant. Incidentally, when I said that they wanted to go ahead and retest the DNA in 2019 and have the Texas Department of Public Safety do it, they went ahead and did that and used up the rest of the DNA from the fingernail swabbing, I believe. And they did determine that Lydell Grant was in fact excluded from that mixture. But they claim that the Texas Department of Public Safety did not get adequate results such that they could upload it into CODIS. So thank goodness we didn't have to rely on law enforcement.
Oh, inconsistent again, it sounds like.
Yeah.
And Mike, I have a note here that you mentioned that the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, sat on it, but I have a note here that they refused his exoneration request, and instead they asked that the 6 eyewitnesses who originally testified against him respond to his claims of innocence. Is that true?
Yeah. Well, this is what did happen. we submitted all of this to the Court of Criminal Appeals by January of 2020, early 2020, or late 2019. And in April of 2019, or 2020 rather, they sent back an order to the trial judge that said, we want you to send us the actual video recording of the perpetrator confessing, which was unusual and kind of odd. I thought maybe they were just kind of, curious. I don't know. Maybe they themselves wanted to play investigator. Maybe all of a sudden they thought they were experts on false confessions or something. I don't know. Maybe they didn't believe the police. Maybe they didn't believe the prosecutor. Maybe they didn't believe the judge. Maybe they didn't believe us, and they wanted to see it themselves. And who knows what kind of mischief they wanted to create out of that. But anyway, we sent it to them. That's fine. And right away. And then we didn't hear anything until July. March, 3 months later. And it was at that point that they sent out another order ordering the judge, the district judge, who had already found Lydell to be actually innocent, to gather affidavits from the 6 eyewitnesses. Now, this is during a pandemic, and this is 10 years later. To the judge to get affidavits from the 6 eyewitnesses explaining what their position is now about whether or not they were wrong about their eyewitness identification, which is crazy.
They're not family. They're not. I mean, I understand going to family members and whatever of the deceased, but the eyewitnesses, they don't have a dog in this fight.
Well, I mean, I don't know what the thought process was, but it couldn't have been good. I don't know whether they I don't know. I mean, this was a DNA exoneration, even without the confession. Whether you've got, this was a DNA exoneration plus. Now, why they would try to send people on that kind of fool's errand in a pandemic when the Harris County DA's office is trying to prosecute the actual perpetrator, and I mean, do they want to hold these people up for ridicule?
Right.
I mean, these people, they have participated in putting away an innocent man. Do you think they want this kind of attention brought on them? And what are they going to say? I mean, at this point, it really doesn't even matter what they say. They were wrong.
This whole story, when I don't know about you, when you were in law school, how you learned about wrongful identifications in your crim law class. I think you teach some of these classes now, right?
Yes.
I remember my professor coming in, it was, I think, the first day of crim law, and he came in a crazy outfit, and he, he ran around stealing things, and then he ran out. And then he got back dressed, and he came in, and he started asking us law students who were, 20s, who were paying attention, who were, reasonably intelligent people, to identify what they saw. And I remember the exercise of everybody getting it wrong, right?
Right.
What did he steal, and what was he wearing, and how tall and how short? He might have actually even had an actor do it with him. It's been so long.
Right.
When I'm thinking about this case, this is the most perfect case to teach in law school, to teach anybody about, cops, anything about how bad wrongful IDs are. I mean, we talk about it all the time, but I have not seen a case where there were 6 eyewitnesses, and some of them saying they're for sure certain that this was the person. They get up under oath, pointed at the man. This was him. This is a academic lesson right here that needs to be turned into some kind of short movie or something to show everybody who can see it how bad judges need to see it. Everybody needs to see it. This is a man who spent 10 years in prison for these 6. I mean, I don't, you blame them, of course, but you of course blame the detectives who led them down the path of picking the person they wanted them to pick. I mean, the tunnel vision of their investigation. I mean, the killer was out there. They didn't do a good enough job to find him. And God knows how many other crimes Mr. Carter committed in those 10 years.
Exactly.
He doesn't sound like a good guy.
Well, I don't know him, and he's still got to stand trial. So we'll see what happens. But he is indicted and he is in custody, and the murder charge is pending against him.
Is Mr. Grant going to get? Is he going to get some money in Texas for being wrongfully convicted?
Well, we were able to get a statute passed back in 2011, or actually it was 2009, I believe. And if someone is found to be actually innocent after they've been convicted and incarcerated, not if they get relief on some other ground, but if they meet the high standard of actual innocence, then they are entitled to $80,000 a year for every year they're locked up.
Okay. Probably not enough, but it's better than nothing.
I agree.
In Michigan, it's 50,000, which isn't enough. And of course, I don't even need to ask it, but of course, nobody else is held accountable. The DAs, the detectives, nobody else is ever held accountable for putting this innocent man in prison.
No, and I'll point out that the district attorney's office was able to get a written declaration from one of the witnesses. I think they talked to all of them, but they only got a written declaration for one. And the witness basically said, the police told me who to pick.
And they turned that over to you?
Yeah, the Court of Criminal Appeals required that to be made part of the record. That was part of the order. That was in response to the court's order. So that was sent back to the Court of Criminal Appeals. And like I said, eventually, I mean, that was done in January, and May the 19th, the Court of Criminal Appeals ruled.
And even if you could identify that exact detective, that person's never going to be held accountable either.
No. I mean, that's just, people make mistakes, part of the job.
Yeah. So, you mentioned this law that you got passed. I think that, not even half of the states have, proper identification laws that say, what you described earlier, that it's got to be blind. The detective, whoever's putting on the lineup can't know who the suspect is.
Right.
How do we get that passed in every state?
Well, you're asking the wrong person. We just had a very dismal year at the legislature when we were trying to get a lot of bipartisan laws passed on criminal justice reform, and almost nothing got through. And I don't know if it was all backlash because of the George Floyd case and a bunch of white politicians showing what they think of Black Lives Matter or what. So I'm not the guru on getting legislation passed, although we have had some success in the past. Mostly what's worked with us is having exonerees show up and tell their story. That's been one of the most effective ways to persuade legislatures at the committee hearings. Have exonerees such as Lydell Grant show up and tell their story.
He's the poster child. We should fly him around the country in those states that don't have it. He
would do it.
I'd love to meet him one day. Maybe we can arrange that. That would be, I'd love for him to be able to tell his story. It's as frustrating of a story as I've ever heard. And we've had 10 or 11 exonerees on our show. And this one is right up there. And they're all frustrating. They're all frustrating in different ways. But to have 6 people, I can't imagine he's sitting there at trial and there's 6 people pointing at him saying he killed that man. I can't even imagine. 6,
well,
not 1. Usually it's 1.
Right.
6. How does 6? Who's not going to convict on 6 people? Who's not
know.
going to convict? I mean, it's a slam dunk. I asked this to an exoneree recently. Did you know you were going to get convicted? He said, absolutely. I would have convicted myself, he said. And I bet you Mr. Grant would say the same thing.
Probably so.
I
Yes.
mean, it's just kind of mind-boggling. I saw a statistic that you believe, or over 5,000 people, at least 5,000 people or more in Texas prisons are actually innocent. You stand by that number?
I think so. It's there's no real, scientific way to determine that. I know that the academics who study these sorts of things have assigned the number of somewhere around 6% of people who are convicted are actually innocent of the conviction. And if you just apply that number to the number of people locked up in Texas prisons, it comes out to a large number.
Well, you are in a tough state, a very conservative state. The fact that you have an Innocence Project that you founded is just amazing. I think you're doing really great work, and I appreciate it, and I'm sure the people of Texas appreciate it. If people watching, listening to Open Mic want to help the Innocence Project of Texas, how could they find you?
You can go on our website, innocencetexas.org, or call me on my cell phone. Hell, 817-992-1132.
That's great. That is great, Mike. Well, thank you for being on Open Mic. I think these stories are so important to tell for lots and lots of reasons. I think that the public absolutely needs to know what's going on out there. Thankfully, more and more people are getting let out of prison who are wrongfully convicted. There's more and more the integrity units are being set up in more and more cities and states, which I think is super duper important. And I think Mr. Grant is really, really lucky that you set up such a good team there to look at his case. So congratulations on the success. Keep up the good work. And
Well,
thank you for being
Thank you very much, Mike, for giving me the opportunity to come on your show and talk about the case. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
It's my pleasure. Nice to meet you. Texas Innocence Project came through for Lydell Grant. 6 eyewitnesses said he killed a man and they were dead wrong. The actual killer, proven by DNA evidence, is on trial right now in the state of Georgia, or going to be on trial in the state of Georgia. Just mind-blowing. 6. I can't wrap my head around it. Let me know what you think about this case. Let me know what you think happened here. I'd love to hear from you. And if you need to share this show with somebody who should hear it as well, please forward it. Please like our show, comment, and we really appreciate it. We're well over 100 episodes, almost 4 million downloads and listens for our show, and it's flattering, and I'm grateful for all of the support and all the people watching and listening. So thank you. Thank you for being a fan of Open Mic, and we'll see you next time.